Once the largest and finest non-royal residence in the British Isles, Hamilton Palace stood as the grand home to the Dukes of Hamilton for nearly 300 years, and inside its magnificent walls lived treasures to rival those of the royal collection, with exquisite furniture, famed paintings, coveted ornaments, and the finest pieces of antiquity, only for the palace's destruction in 1919 to result in one of the greatest losses to the national heritage of the United Kingdom. Hamilton Palace takes its name from the family for which it would be built, the Hamilton Chiefs of Scotland, the lineage of which began with Walter Fitzgilbert of Hambledon during the late 13th and early 14th centuries, Walter being a Scottish nobleman who, in gratitude for his support of Robert the Bruce during the Battle of Bannockburn, was awarded lands in Lanarkshire and the Lothians, which included the ancient settlement of Cadzow, located 10 miles southeast of Glasgow, the Hamilton family name officially coming into existence from 1375, when David de Hamilton, son and heir of David Fitzwalter, first signed a writ, and thereby started a story which would stretch for over 800 years, and in that time see the family hold great influence in the history and society of Scotland. With newly acquired lands in Lanarkshire, the Hamiltons established the family seat on the edge of the town of Cadzow, starting with a defensive tower known variously as the Orchard or the Castle of Hamilton, first referred to in a charter during 1445, when James Hamilton received letters patent, creating him a Lord of Parliament, which raised all his estates into the entail of that rank, with its capital Mesage being at the Orchard, while all lands belonging to him would be given the title of his family name, and included the renaming of Cadzow to its modern moniker of Hamilton, the Orchard's architecture being typical of defensive structures of the late medieval period, as it featured walls up to 8 foot 10 inches thick in order to repel attacks by catapults and other siege weapons. In 1543, James Hamilton, Duke of Châtellerault, and great-grandson of King James II of Scotland, which thereby made him heir presumptive to the Scottish throne throughout the 1500s, was dubbed a regent of Scotland during the minority of Mary, Queen of Scots, and to reflect his new status, began rebuilding the Orchard as an opulent palace, although this original structure was short-lived, as during the Marian Civil War and the intervention of foreign armies under the banner of Queen Elizabeth I of England between 1565 and 1579, the castle and the town of Hamilton were burned on multiple occasions, leaving the structure a heavily damaged ruin by the turn of the 1580s, only for it to be rediscovered by King James VI during a hunting trip in 1589, who saw that the original orchard was rebuilt and enlarged in 1591 on a quadrangular footprint, thus creating the palace. By 1643, the palace had returned to its rightful place as the stately residence of the Hamiltons, with the incumbent head of the family, James Hamilton, 3rd Marquess of Hamilton and Earl of Arran, being ennobled the peerage of a dukedom for services to King Charles I after his involvement as an influential military leader during the 30 Years' War, a 17th century religious conflict fought primarily in Central Europe between the Catholic and Protestant states that formed the Holy Roman Empire, the Dukedom of Hamilton being the premier peerdom of Scotland and the third oldest in the United Kingdom, surpassed only by the Dukes of Norfolk and Somerset, James Hamilton, after his return from the conflict, taking the role of Charles's principal Scottish advisor. James's place of power in the court of King Charles didn't last, and in the subsequent Wars of the Three Kingdoms, he faced off against his own mother, Anne, Marchioness of Hamilton, who was a colonel in the opposing army of the Covenanters, while 5 years later he was arrested by the king and imprisoned in Pendennis Castle for his growing misconduct and inaction during negotiations with the Covenanters, later being released in 1646, before leading a campaign during the Second English Civil War in 1648 to rescue Charles from the parliamentarian forces of Oliver Cromwell, who had imprisoned the monarch at Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight, awaiting a trial that would eventually lead to his execution. Hamilton, despite leading a force of 24,000 men against Cromwell's 9,000-man army, being defeated and captured at the Battle of Preston in Lancashire, whereupon he was tried and condemned to death by beheading on March 9, 1649. The lineage, however, continued through his brother, William, Earl of Lanark, and following a quiet start to his place in the peerage, keeping largely out of political affairs, he soon found himself a fervent supporter of Charles I and later Charles II after the latter had fled to Holland in exile, William returning to Scotland in 1650 before dying at the Battle of Worcester in 1651, after which the dukedom passed, for the first and only time, to a woman in all its history, with Anne, James Hamilton's daughter, inheriting instead of her cousins, as William's will denied the succession to his own daughters, making Anne what should have been one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Scotland, though this was hampered by the fact that the death of her father and uncle had left the estate with huge debts, and large parcels of Hamilton land were confiscated, these only being settled following her marriage to William Douglas, 1st Earl of Selkirk, in 1656, who helped to not only pay off her debts and reacquire the seized elements of her property, but was also instrumental in the transformation of Hamilton Palace into the most opulent non-royal residence in Britain. In 1698, Anne chose to surrender the title to her eldest son, James, 4th Duke of Hamilton, but his life also proved to be both short and full of political intrigue, as the young James was suspected of being a Jacobite following William of Orange's rise to the King of England in 1689, deposing James II of England and 6th of Scotland, whom Hamilton would support during his ultimately fruitless struggle to retake the throne during 1690, James Hamilton later taking a seat in the Scottish Parliament during 1700 to protest the upcoming Act of Union, which would eventually marry the governance of England and Scotland to form the United Kingdom in 1707, while also being a major investor in the Darien scheme, an unsuccessful attempt, backed largely by investors of the Kingdom of Scotland, to gain wealth and influence by establishing New Caledonia, a colony on the Isthmus of Panama, a fiscal catastrophe which cost Scotland almost half its currency in circulation at the time, James eventually being killed in November 1712 during a duel against Charles, 4th Duke of Mohun, over a disputed inheritance, James killing Charles, but was himself run through by the sword of Mohun's second, George Macartney, who would later be tried and condemned to death in absentia for Hamilton's murder. The outrage this brutal event caused in the polite society of the time, seeing a law passed through Parliament that meant duellers could only fight with pistols. During the turbulent years of the 4th Duke, Hamilton Palace was expanded under what was dubbed the Great Design between 1684 and 1701, these works leading to the creation of a U-plan country house with an open south-facing courtyard, which followed the outline of the existing late 16th century enclosed quadrangle. While under the direction of the architect James Smith, the south quarter of Hamilton Palace was removed entirely, the east and west quarters were rebuilt as courtyard wings, and the north wing was left largely as it was, although it was refaced and remodelled internally. The rebuilt south front, which was completed between 1693 and 1701, being adorned in a classic Palladian style, the principal feature of this new formal ceremonial entrance being the front piece with its huge Corinthian portico, while the remodelled north front played host to a 120-foot-long gallery, which occupied the entire first floor. Under the auspices of James, 5th Duke of Hamilton, who lived a short but comparatively quiet life, being one of the London Foundling Hospital's first governors, but at the same time was secretly made a Knight of the Garter and a Knight of the Thistle by the Jacobite Old Pretender James Francis Edward Stuart in 1723, which left him viewed with great suspicion by the British government. He significantly improved the Hamilton properties and estates with the help of the leading Scottish architect William Adam, their main achievement being the hunting lodge at Chateau Larue, which has now been carefully restored and is open to the public, although more radical plans for Hamilton Palace itself, including a new north front, were stymied by James's death at the age of 40 from jaundice and palsy in 1743, with the significant costs involved in this scheme preventing them from being executed, although a major refurbishment of the interior decoration was carried out in the east wing of the palace under Adam's supervision, followed by modifications and expansions across the next century, which would include the purchase or exchange of land surrounding the palace, enabling extensive landscaping to take place. The 6th Duke, also named James, unfortunately did not inherit the same modesty of his father, and gained a notorious reputation as a womanizer, which came to a head on Valentine's Day 1752, when he proposed to society beauty Elizabeth Gunning on the very same night he'd met her, and were secretly wed at Mayfair House, after a local parson refused to perform the ceremony, the 6th Duke's reign only lasting 6 years, as he died from a cold while out hunting in January 1758 at the age of 33, followed by another short-lived tenure when the 7th Duke, James and Elizabeth's eldest son, James George, succeeded as heir apparent at the age of 2, but eventually died in 1769 at the age of 14 from tuberculosis, leaving the peerage in the hands of James George's younger brother, Douglas, who was shipped to Europe for his constitution and undertook a grand tour in 1772, travelling with Dr. John Moore and his son, later to become Moore of Coroner. Sadly, though, Douglas, as a paramour, continued the family legacy of womanizing, having many mistresses and being father to 2 illegitimate children, followed, in the wake of his death in 1799, by his uncle Archibald, who became the 9th Duke of Hamilton, although Douglas, in a not too uncommon act of skullduggery, left the contents of Hamilton Palace itself to his illegitimate daughter with actress Harriet Pye Bennett, meaning Archibald was forced to buy them back or risk losing the family seat, the effects of which, combined with his persistent gout, meaning he suffered heavily from depression, and thus gave up responsibility for the Hamilton's Scottish estates to his eldest son Alexander, before retiring to quiet life at his old home near Lancaster. Nevertheless, in addition to the fact that Archibald was the first of the Hamiltons since the 4th Duke a century prior to live beyond the age of 50, he was also a serving Member of Parliament and a prominent figure in the world of thoroughbred horse racing, while Alexander was a fervent art collector, spending much of his youth in Italy collecting all manner of artworks and treasures that would come to define the interior furnishings of Hamilton Palace, carefully restoring and refining its elegant rooms over the course of 50 years in order to assemble one of the finest collections of important works of art associated with Roman and Russian emperors, popes and cardinals, Queen Marie Antoinette, and even the Emperor Napoleon. His return to Britain in 1801, leading him to become a trustee of the British Museum, Vice President of the Royal Institution for the Encouragement of the Fine Arts in Scotland, Grand Master of the Freemasons in Scotland, and a Fellow of the Royal Society and the Society of Antiquities of London, his collection of paintings, objects, books, and manuscripts being eventually sold at public auction in July 1882 for the princely sum of £397,562, or £33 million in 2022. These grand tastes were reflected through his desire to enhance and enlarge the north front of Hamilton Palace, using the vast wealth that the family had derived from their ownership of the Lanarkshire coalfields in order to create a grand residence which not only reflected the increasing wealth and national standing of the family, but also provided an appropriately grand setting for the considerable art collections which he continued to gather, including the Beckford Art Collection and Library that his wife Susan had inherited from her father, William Thomas Beckford, the refurbishment of Hamilton Palace including the addition of heraldic carvings in the main pediment over the entrance, carved by John Greenshields in 1822, followed in 1828 by the north front itself being enhanced and enlarged by the distinguished Glasgow architect David Hamilton, creating a 15-bayed, 3-storey structure that was 265 feet long and 60 feet high, adorned with a colossal portico of 6 25-foot-high Corinthian columns. Internally, and further to the existing rooms such as the Long Gallery, Old Dining Room, Old State Breakfast Room, Old State Drawing Room, and Old State Bedroom, new staterooms such as the Egyptian Hall, Entrance Hall, Tribune, Billiard Room, Charter Room, State Dining Room, Drawing Room, State Bedroom, Music Room, the Hamilton Library and the Beckford Library were built, in which were placed a majority of the palace's fine furniture, and by the mid-19th century housed one of the best private collections of paintings in Scotland, including works by Peter Paul Rubens, Titian, Anthony van Dyck, and other masters, while a sumptuous chimney-piece created by William Morgan adorned the dining room's fireplace, the new palace providing an appropriate setting for a number of magnificent social events, including an 1831 visit by Marie-Thérèse of France, the eldest child of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, while in 1843, Henri, Count of Chambord, visited the palace, and a grand reception was held there following the marriage of the future 11th Duke to Princess Marie-Amélie of Baden, while other visitors included the 1851 arrival of Victoria, Duchess of Kent, and mother of Queen Victoria, and an 1860 visit by the French Empress Eugénie, who was hosted at a grand ball which attracted a sizable crowd of eager onlookers from across the country. Another taste brought home from Italy was also a sense of grandeur, with Alexander carrying a lifelong belief that, as a descendant of James Hamilton, regent to Mary Queen of Scots, he was the true heir to the Scottish throne, and had become so enamoured by the ancient Egyptians that he had mummification expert Thomas Pettigrew embalm him after his death in 1852, whereupon he was buried in a sarcophagus, his son, William, 11th Duke of Hamilton, succeeding to the title, but spent very little time in Scotland, instead being an ardent admirer of the Emperor Napoleon, and persuaded his son to marry Princess Marie of Baden, the daughter of Napoleon's own adopted daughter, Stéphanie de Beauharnais, their marriage in 1843 leading them to spend much of their time at residences in Paris and Baden, while much like his father, he too was a collector of fine treasures, including old silver and other antiquities, as well as investing heavily in lavish splendour, but not at Hamilton Palace, instead buying 22 Arlington Street in St James's, London, from Henry Somerset, 7th Duke of Beaufort, for £60,000, or £5.3 million in 2022. It was at this point that interest in the family seat at Hamilton began to fade, as similar to William's ambivalence to Scottish and English affairs, his son, also named William and the 12th Duke, also enjoyed the high life, being a lover of horse racing and steam yachts, including his own steam yacht, Thistle, which was moored at Ipswich, his primary residences being chosen based on their proximity either to major racecourses, such as Bruddock Castle on the Isle of Arran and Easton Park in Suffolk, or allowed for easy access by his yacht, as per his residence near Cowes on the Isle of Wight, though William's love of the high life resulted, on more than one occasion, in the near ruin of the Hamilton family, his keen interest in boxing and gambling only serving to exacerbate the fortune he spent on thoroughbred racehorses. By the end of the century, the Hamilton estates were no longer as profitable as they once were, and although Broddick Castle in Arran and Hamilton Palace brought in a regular income, the family's debts were spiralling into the hundreds of thousands of pounds, with the 12th Duke's expenditure rapidly increasing this figure to a debt of around £1.5 million by 1865, or £131 million in 2022, his future prospects only saved by a lucky bet on the steeplechase race at the 1867 Grand National, the prize money helping to restore his personal purse for the rest of his tenure as the Duke of Hamilton, although the continued debts of the family meant that the many fineries and treasures accumulated by his grandfather Alexander had to be auctioned off in 1882 to settle these expenses. In 1895, the 12th Duke died while aboard the Thistle at anchor in Algiers, and with his sole heir being the 10-year-old Lady Mary Hamilton, the title of 13th Duke of Hamilton and the 157,000-acre estate passed to his fourth cousin, Alfred Douglas Hamilton, a frail man who, when serving with the Royal Navy, had contracted a rare tropical disease in 1890, which left him partially paralysed, and although he was able to recover from his illness, the Hamilton family debts continued to hover at around £1 million, with the Duke's trust disposition and settlement conveying his estate to trustees, and leaving detailed instructions for the administration of his assets, which comprised the Hamilton estates in Lanarkshire, including Hamilton Palace, the Arran estates of Broddick Castle and the greater part of the Isle of Arran, the Kinneil estates in Stirlingshire, including Kinneil House, and the Eastern estate and the Great Glenham estate in Suffolk. It wouldn't be until July 1908, though, that Douglas Hamilton was able to settle the many debts of his predecessor, while in 1889 he had leased to the Bent Colliery Company, who owned the Hamilton Palace Colliery at nearby Bothwellhaugh, the coal seams located under the Low Parks, which were to be worked on a system known as the stoop and room method, which would have left Hamilton Palace and the nearby mausoleum supported by the pillars of coal known as stoops, although as part of the agreement made with the Duke's Trust. While Hamilton Palace was the residence and family seat of the Hamilton peerage, it was the prerogative of the trustees, should the structure fall into decline, as to what the palace's fate should be, with options for either rebuilding or demolishing the structure being considered viable. The reality was that Hamilton Palace, like many ostentatious country houses during the first quarter of the 20th century, had been rendered long obsolete, primarily due to the fact that these gigantic structures, aside from no longer performing a defensive role, were incredibly expensive to maintain and operate, while in the face of the many flammable materials used to decorate their lavish interiors, including polished wooden floors and ornate curtains and furniture, very few of these buildings were insured in the event of fire, while policies available at the time for the valuable contents of the house, as well as the structure itself, were ruinously expensive, leading many noble households to either sell, rebuild or demolish their country estates, examples including Trentham Hall in Staffordshire, Clumber Park in Nottinghamshire, and Eaton Hall in Cheshire. While the writing may have been on the wall for Hamilton Palace, this wasn't to say it had lost all its magnificence during its final years, the gigantic country house hosting, in July 1914, King George V and Queen Mary during a grand reception held by the Duke and Duchess of Hamilton, while in June 1915, during the height of World War I, the Duke lent part of the building to the Royal Navy for use as a hospital for soldiers and sailors who had been injured during the fighting and had been discharged from hospitals and convalescent homes, the use of this structure as a hospital being its final hurrah, as in November of the same year, the Duke's trustees granted the Bent Colliery Company the authority to work the coal seam beneath Hamilton Palace. Thus, with its demolition only stayed by its ongoing use as a hospital, in June 1919 the trustees petitioned the Court of Session for authority to sell the contents of Hamilton Palace and then demolish the building, highlighting that coal workings beneath the palace would otherwise damage or destroy the fabric of the building, thereby resulting, with the approval of the Duke, in permission being granted by the Court of Session on June 12th of that year to tear down the structure, the sale of the Hamilton Palace collection taking place 6 months later at Christie's Auction House in London, during which £232,847 of furniture was sold, including porcelain, silver plate, tapestries, jewellery, and original paintings by Van Dyck, Rubens, Rembrandt, Reynolds, Romney, Raeburn, Delacroix, and Winterhalter, while other items from the palace, including wood panelling, smaller items of furniture, porcelain, carpets, curtains, sculptures, and fittings, was sold from the palace directly, raising £29,000. Though attempts were made in May 1920 by Hamilton Town Council to repair and refurbish the building with a view to restoring it and converting it into flats for public housing, the money needed to purchase the building from the trustees could not be raised, while as a last gesture of goodwill, the Duke and Duchess gifted 22 acres of ground at the south front of Hamilton Palace to the town council for recreational purposes in December of the same year, the opulent stately home eventually being sold to an Edinburgh-based building contractor in October 1921, with demolition work commencing a month later, removal of the building continuing through until 1926, while the final sections were torn down in 1932. The last pieces of the former Hamilton estate, at approximately 750 acres in size, being purchased by Hamilton Town Council in July 1922 for £20,250, which included the Hamilton Mausoleum, the stables and the riding school. Today, the former site of Hamilton Palace is now occupied by the bowling pavilion, the bowling greens and the car park of the Hamilton Palace Sports Ground, while the remaining original structures include the Hamilton Collegiate Church of 1451, the Netherton Cross of the 10th century, and is the oldest symbol of Christianity in Hamilton, the Hamilton Palace Riding School of 1842, and the Hamilton Mausoleum, a grandiose enlargement of Hamilton Palace, which was commissioned by Alexander, 10th Duke of Hamilton, and houses the family vault in which Alexander himself, together with the various Dukes and Duchesses of Hamilton from the 3rd to the 12th Duke and Duchess, now lie in eternal rest, the high stone structure also having the distinction of having held the record for the longest echo within any man-made structure in the world, taking 15 seconds for the sound of a slammed door to fade, this record being eventually broken in 2014 by the Inchindown oil storage tanks in the Scottish Highlands. As for the Hamilton family itself, Lieutenant Hamilton eventually passed away in March 1940 at the age of 78, passing the title to his son Douglas Hamilton, the 14th Duke, a pioneering aviator who conducted the first ever flight over Mount Everest in 1933 using a Western PV-3 biplane, the extremely high altitude of the flight helping to demonstrate the need for cabin pressurization, which today is a standard among commercial airliners. Although the 14th Duke is most famously remembered for the fact that, following his secret flight to Scotland during May 1941, Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess of Nazi Germany specifically sought the Duke in order to sign a peace treaty between the British and Germany during World War II without the approval of Hitler's government, Hess having claimed that he had met the Duke of Hamilton when he attended the 1936 Berlin Summer Olympics, although Hamilton claimed that he had not met Hess during this event and was instead courted at a grand dinner hosted by Joachim von Ribbentrop, the German ambassador to Britain and later foreign minister, the Duke never meeting Hess after his landing in Scotland, with the latter being imprisoned by the British authorities until the end of the war and the subsequent Nuremberg trials. With the 14th Duke's death in 1973, Angus Douglas Hamilton became the 15th Duke and would hold the peerage until his own son, Alexander Douglas Hamilton, became the 16th Duke upon his father's passing in 2010, the Hamilton family now residing at Lennox Love House, a grand country estate in East Lothian located 18 miles east of Edinburgh, which incorporates into its structure the former tower of the preceding 15th century fort, Lethington Castle, the house having been purchased by the 14th Duke in 1946, and is known for its impressive collection of art, many items of which were previously displayed at Hamilton Palace, Lennox Love House being open to the public during the summer, and can be privately rented for functions such as corporate events and weddings. Nevertheless, despite the destruction of the gigantic Hamilton Palace in the 1920s though, much of the essence that made the structure so grand lives on in the form of priceless treasures either sold off or donated by the Duke and Duchess during its final days, with the majority of these exquisite items now being displayed in the collection of the National Museum of Scotland, these various pieces giving an impression as to the luxury life that was once enjoyed by the many Dukes and Duchesses who have held the peerage of the Hamilton family, and an insight as to how these magnificent ornaments would have once looked back in their opulent country home of the now long demolished Hamilton Palace.